Guten Abend. I am Wilhelmina Friederike Michael Kottwiitz. I was born in Prussia, which is now Germany, on April 26, 1824. In 1864, my husband, Wilhelm Gottlieb Kottwiitz, and I left our home in Prussia with our 8 children, ages 15 years to just under 1 year. We wanted to make a new life in the United States. It was a very big risk to come to a country that was in a civil war, but it was much riskier to stay in our homeland. My husband was a farmer, but it was hard to find enough land to support a family. The military leaders were constantly at war with Denmark, France, and Austria, trying to gain more land for Prussia. There was also constant political turmoil, and the head of the military, Otto von Bismarck, issued a mandatory military service requirement of 3 years for all Prussian men. So Wilhelm and I decided to immigrate to America, where land was plentiful and inexpensive. After getting off the ship in New York, we traveled to Gasconade County, Missouri, where many other families from Prussia had settled in earlier years. We got a homestead near the small community of Woollam. There we cut down trees and built a log home. Wilhelm and our sons cleared land to begin growing food for our family and our animals, which we had purchased from neighbors. I grew vegetables and raised chickens for eggs and meat. We had a cow for milk and cream. Also, there was an abundance of wild game in the woods. Soon after our homestead was settled, our 4 oldest daughters got married, and they began families of their own. You might recognize their family names: Haspel, Mickey, Mittendorf, and Heidland. As an interesting side note, the daughter who married Mr. Heidland, whose wife had died leaving him with 3 children, became the stepmother to the young lady who would later marry our youngest son, August. Sadly, our youngest daughter, Emily, died as a young child, and our youngest son, Adam, who was born in America, did not live to see his first birthday. After our 2 oldest sons married and left home, Wilhelm and I lived with August on the original homestead. August married Minnie Heidland on August the 25th, 1902. I lived to see 2 of their children, Marie and Emma. However, Emma only lived 1 week after birth. I died on January 25th, 1906. Wilhelm lived to see 2 of August and Minnie's sons, namely Zwingli and Albert. Wilhelm died on December 12, 1910. We have scores of descendants, many of which are still in this community, although some of them are scattered across the entire United States. I am being portrayed by my great-granddaughter, Mary Ellen Kottwiitz Hall, who is the oldest daughter of Zwingli. There are 4 generations of my family buried in this cemetery. August and Minnie are buried up at the top, as is their youngest son, George. Zwingli and Albert and Marie and their families are buried down at this lower end. I thank you for your attention and hope you enjoyed the information I have given you. Are there any questions?
Are you dying in that outfit?
Yes, it's very warm.
My name is Friedrich Strehlmann. I was born in 1848 in Germany, but we moved with my family, Casper and Catherine Strehlmann. We moved to the U.S. in 1855, and then we moved. I would say today we would say that it was near Jeffersburg, Missouri, south of Leslie. And we lived there for, my father was a farmer, and we lived there for the first 25 years of my life. And I studied the wheelwright trade. This is my wife, Hannah Marie, and she will say a little bit about her work.
My name is Hannah Marie Strehlmann, and they actually called me Marie. My father was Friedrich Adolf Tolke, and my mother was Wilhelmina Sophia Willenkamp Tolke. My parents were married in 1849 in St. Louis, and immediately after went out towards a farm in south of Leslie, and they left because there was a cholera epidemic in St. Louis. I am the second of 8 children that were born to that union. And because I was the oldest daughter, as the family was being raised, I certainly helped a great deal with my younger siblings. I met my husband, Friedrich Strehlmann, because his family's farm was close to ours, and of course we intermingled. And we got married on the 29th of January in 1873, and within a year, January of 1934, we had our first child named Wilhelmina Carolina. Carrie is what we called her for short.
Well, after we were married in '73, we moved from the farm just north and east a little bit to what you would know today as a stone house, I should say, that's still standing, by the way, on Highway 50 and the junction of AJ. That is still there today. We moved there and we had our first 2 children, like she said, Caroline and William were both born there. During the few years that we stayed there, we received a contact from a little town in Gasconade County of New Woollam, and they were looking for a wheelwright to help them in the blacksmith trade. Actually, it was Mr. Juneman that had contacted us and said that they would really like us to come to Woollam to practice that trade with him in his blacksmith work. So when we came to Woollam in 1877, and it was a wonderful community, and they helped us to build a house. We built a beautiful 2-story house in Woollam and a shop that we worked in. And our next 2 children were born when we were there. That was George and Emmy. And then we adopted a young girl named Lydia a little later on. I was raised Lutheran, but my wife, of course, was a good Methodist. So I became a member of the Methodist Church for the first almost 10 years, I guess, that we were in Woollam. We went to the church in Old Land. But as the community grew, it became apparent that we would like a church of our own closer to home. So I sold them 20 acres of ground that I owned up on Green Ridge, where we are today. And I sold them 20 acres of ground. But we cut some timber off of this ground, and Anna kind of took my thunder, but the timber that was cut here for the church site was taken to Woollam. I owned a sawmill at that time. It was actually on the creek right by our house, and that sawmill was powered by a water wheel from the creek. And we sawed that lumber and brought it back up here and built our first church in 1889.
Within a short time, it was very evident that we also needed a cemetery. Many of the rural churches out here would have the church and then the cemetery in back. And because we had a cemetery, my husband, who was already working with wood to make wheels, we found a need for him to now make, sadly, coffins. And then he even was serving as the undertaker a number of times when the minister wasn't around. Sadly, the first 4 graves in this cemetery were children's graves. And while we were fortunate not to have lost any of our own, it was a small community, and of course the loss of any child is a sorrowful thing to endure. So we were very, very busy but sad in the beginning for the reason for our cemetery here.
I was we both were very active in the church at that time. I served as, Anna used the word exhorter, and an exhorter was a lay minister, basically, but there was a lot of times in the early church when the ministers were not here, and the exhorter or lay minister spoke quite often. I served for that purpose, but it was a little different then. We had a book called the Book of Sermons, and I would just read a sermon from that book. I wouldn't have to come up with my own. I would just read a sermon that probably some minister told me I should read. I also served for well over 50 years as a Sunday school superintendent in this church, and my wife also was very involved in the church and served many years as a Sunday school teacher. In the late 1890, the store burnt in Woollam, and so for a couple of years we allowed our upstairs of our house to be used as a store, since there was no other place in Woollam, and we actually had to build an outside stairs on that house, and that house still exists today with the outside stairs, and that's where we had a store for a number of years. When the store was rebuilt in Woollam, the one that you see there today, when that store was rebuilt, in 1892, I was by that time owner, and I needed some help. As you can maybe tell, I was a pretty busy man, so I needed some help. So I found a fine young man who just lived right over the hill, named Herman Boettcher, and he came and was partnered with me in the store for a number of years. At that time, I also had my oldest daughter, was 18 years old, and she worked in the store, and as you can probably guess, you get two people that young in the store together, and we were very happy that in our house we had a wedding 2 years later.
And Carrie had a fine house built by her husband for her, just up the hill. It had a wonderful stone foundation and a two-story clapboard. They were not quite as fortunate as we were in the beginning. They waited 9 years to have a child, and in the interim, they adopted a child, Maggie, from the children's home in Methodist Children's Home in St. Louis. But in 1904, they had a little girl by the name of Ella, and 8 years later, a son was born, William John, whom we fondly called Willie. He was born in 1912, and he would come down and play in our little area. He loved to be with his grandfather, and unlike the last story that I told about the sadness of burying children, this story about coffins is a little bit more light and humorous. He had a little playmate by the name of Pearl Schenemeyer. And when he was 6 or 7 or 8, they would play a game called funeral. And in that game, one of them, and they always argued about who would be the first, would lay down in the coffin, and the other one would conduct a funeral. And they would exhort each other's higher qualities and how sorely they would be missed in the community and how sad everyone was. And of course, the next person got the chance, and they would switch places, and then, in this case, it was most likely Pearl would be the one in the coffin, and then little Willie would go around and say the sermon for Pearl.
A little later in our lives, I did want to mention that we were involved, that I was a director and one of the organizers of the Farmers Merchant Bank in Owensville. That was a task that we took on, and I think that was in 1913 we did that. One of the great things that are, one of the memorable things I should say in our life was in 1933, when I was 85 years old already, our family and we put together, and they put together, a wonderful 60th anniversary for Marie and I, and that was a memory that we'll always have. We had it in our home there in Woollam, and it was quite an occasion.
It was absolutely wonderful. The community supported us, our children were there, and they in fact raised a good sum of money and gave it to us in the hopes that we would use it to make our later years more comfortable, or maybe to do a little traveling. Well, it's been said that I'm a rather devout Methodist, and so I determined, rather than us using the money, that it needed to be used at the Central Wesleyan Orphans Home in Warrenton, and so I sent the money there. And in fact, it was probably a good thing because within 5 months, we wouldn't have had much time to enjoy it. My husband on July the 1st in 1933 passed away. And within 7 months, in April of 1934, I too was gone.
Hi, my name is Margaret Koenig.
Hello, I'm Rickman Boettcher.
I was born September 19, 1846. My father Herman Koenig and mother Meta Toberman Koenig and my 5 siblings came from the village of Riedi in Germany. When I was 10 years old, we traveled across the Atlantic from Bremen to New Orleans, up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and finally arrived in Washington, Missouri. To give the children some exercise, my mother would throw raisins on the floor of the boat. We scrambled to find the raisins as fast as we could. My family and I settled in New Bremen, now called Old Bland, a few days before Christmas in 1856. Father farmed the land and had a mill on the creek.
I am Rickman Boettcher. I was born May 3rd, 1828 in the small village of Berrien in northern Germany, near a city-state of Bremen. My father, Johann Boettcher, died in 1834 at the age of 40 years when I was only 6 years old. My brother, Johann, and I lived with our mother until she died in 1836 at the age of 45. We became orphans at the age of 8 and 11. When my brother died in 1850, making the journey to America seemed like the right thing to do. At the age of 32, I immigrated with some of my Boettcher cousins from Leasty to Gasconade County. After arriving in New York, we took a train to Missouri, where I acquainted myself with the Koenig's family in the neighboring village. In the fall of 1863, I purchased 120 acres of timber and tall grass in Third Creek Township on a trail from Canaan to Woollam.
There is not enough room to put a slop bucket down.
While in Germany, I had received training in masonry and building, which is a great value while building our homestead.
Rickman and I were married on April 11, 1864. That same year, bushwhackers were in the area. They wanted men and horses. Rickman and neighbors took horses and hid in the woods for 2 weeks.
In 1865, our first son, John, was born. 2 years later, we had blessed with another son, Herman. Next name, Allide, who died an infant. Martha Allide, Caroline and Minnie also died as an infant. Henry, William, finally Emma.
For many years, Herman and our son Herman and Wickman worked together in the building trade. Wickman died in the summer of 1896 at the age of 68 while working on a barn for the Shinnewarks. He suffered from a heat stroke and soon passed away. Our son John, who was born in 1865, went to Nebraska with some other Boettchers. The Boettchers he worked for, the head Boettcher that he worked for died. John then married Meta Boettcher, the cousin's widow. Herman was born in 1867 and died in 1940 and married Wilhelmina Caroline Strehlmann. He then built a log frame house in 1870 on the west side of the trail and up the hill. Adelaide was born in 1870, died in 1871 as an infant, was buried in Third Creek, which is now the Canaan Forest. Martha Meadow, 1872, married Paul Mathis. She died in 1906 and is buried at Leduc on Highway B south of Bland. Allide was born in 1875 and did not marry. She died in 1932. Caroline Lena Henrietta, 1877 was her birth. She died in 1924, but she married Adolf Picker. She is also buried at Leduc. Henry William, 1892 to 1969. He married Anna Sassmann, December 12 of 12, and she passed away, and he married Rose Tackett Kreider, October 17 of 48. Emma Margaret Boettcher, 1885, died in 1913. She's buried at the Zor Methodist Cemetary, right here. She was engaged to Mr. Cook. She contracted TB while helping a sister near Redbird and died. In 1912, Henry married Anna Sassmann. Allied and I bought 40 acres on an adjoining land in a cabin. We lived there until Henry built a house in the 1920s.
Hello, I'm Ella Evelyn Leenhoff Sassmann. I was born December 8th, 1906 to John Dietrich Leenhoff and Emma Shasheen Leenhoff in Byron, Missouri. I was the second born of 7 children. I had 3 sisters, Tina, Sophie, and Edna, and 3 brothers, Charlie, Walter, and Joseph. In August of 1931, I married George Frederick Sassmann. He was the second youngest son of Frederick William Sassmann, also called Fritz, and Marie Louise Bach Sassmann. They are buried right next to us. George had a twin brother, William, who's also buried in the cemetery just a few rows down. My sister Sophie married August Beale, and my sister Edna married John Huber. My 3 brothers never married. George and I lived with his parents on their farm just down the driveway. George's father died just 2 months after we were married. His mother lived with us until her death in 1941. Both of George's parents are here in the cemetery. We had 1 son, Carl Eugene Sassmann, who was born on June 17, 1932. George and I attended Woollam Church all our lives. When the church started, the congregation was segregated. Men sat on one side, women would sit on the other side. Well, I guess I got tired of that one day, and I decided to sit with my husband. I was the first woman to sit with her husband the church had ever had. Family was very important to me. I did almost everything with my sisters. We used to go to town to get our hair permed. Well, we decided that was too costly, so we started buying perm supplies, and we did it at home by ourselves. Well, obviously that was illegal, because we got a call one day from the officials saying that unless we had a license to do hair, we were not allowed to do permanents at home. Well, we didn't care for that. So, over the party lines every weekend, we would call each other and with a code word would let each other know it was time for a perm, and we still did it. We worked around the law. They said that we never fought or quarreled, and a bad word was never said between any of the family members. We had lots and lots of fun family gatherings. I was a wonderful baker. I baked coffee cake and bread weekly. I also spent many afternoons working on fancy needlework. George and I also gardened and canned. The whole family would get together to do many of our food endeavors. We worked together making ham, sausage, and beef, and many other things. We also picked many fruits together, making jelly and canning most of it. The men would keep the fires going, and the women peeled, seasoned, and stirred. We also enjoyed making homemade wine. Our son Carl married Mildred Gerloff on August 9, 1953. They blessed us with 3 grandchildren. When my husband George got older, we moved to Owensville and let Carl and his wife come down and live at the farm. The Sassmann farm became a Century farm in 1996. My husband George died on December 9, 1981. I passed away January 27, 1992.
Albertina Brandhors. Since I knew you were coming today, I arrived a little early to take in the peace and quiet of one of my favorite places. That little church you see over there and this cemetery holds some pretty special meaning to me. Just being here has brought a flood of memories of the people and the events that made up my earthly existence. Hopefully you'll forgive me, but I quickly jotted down a few notes of those memories to share with you. I fear I need the crutch of the written word, as my memory is not quite what it used to be. I guess I can be forgiven for becoming a little nostalgic when I find myself once again surrounded by my family and friends that were an integral part of my life while I spent it here on earth. Here next to me is my beloved husband, Henry. His real name was Karl Heinrich Brandhors, but somewhere along life's road it got shortened to Henry. My sister, Ernestina, and her husband, Friedrich Krofchick, rest over there. She was 12 years older than me. It was to them that my parents trusted me and my 3 siblings to travel halfway around the world to this place. 6 of our daughters and 2 of our sons are also laid to rest here. Henry and I had 14 children in all, 11 of which grew to adulthood. My son Walter was one of the first burials in this cemetery, him having lived only 2 days after he was born in 1892. Over there is my daughter Lydia and her husband John Lange. Their son Gilbert is buried right next to them. He was killed in a tractor accident right before my own death. Daughter Carrie and her husband August Nazy lay over here. Our daughter Emily, we called her Emma, lays next to her husband August Studi. 3 of their children, Henry, Charles, and Ida, are also buried close by. When you walk around, you may be confused by there being 2 Ida Besses that are buried right next to each other. One is my granddaughter, who was named after the other, who was my daughter. Both wound up marrying the same man, Clarence Bess. Also, just here, is my daughter Eleanor and her husband Ed Hazeman. My grandson Earl, whose life was cut short by a car accident over by Herman when he was only 19, also rest here. And over there is my son Ed and my daughter Olivia. They both stayed with me on the farm until my time on earth ended, giving up what lives they would have made for themselves to stay and comfort and help me as I aged. Well, I guess you're wondering how we all came to be here. My husband and my oldest daughter, Mary, and I were charter members of this church, having converted to the Methodist faith even before the establishment of the Woollam Church in 1889. Henry had been raised evangelical, and I had been confirmed in the State Church of Germany. We found the Methodist teachings very much to our liking. 4 of my sisters, Augusta, married to William Kepke, Wilhelmina, married to Herman Krause, Ernestine, married to Friedrich Krofchick, and Emily, married to Andrew Lepp, were also charter members of this church. My immigration to America happened the year before my parents immigrated. The year was 1868, and I had reached the age of 15. I and my party traveled on a ship named Cosmos, which was a 3-mast sailing vessel. We arrived in New Orleans one day before the 4th of July. The crossing was unusually long, taking 14 weeks, because the ship had to be repaired en route. We had very little water left by the time we made land, and were being allowed only sips at a time. Once on American soil, we made our way immediately to Woollam to join our brother Ferdinand, who had arrived 4 years earlier and had established himself on a farm by Third Creek. My parents, Johann and Caroline Barlish, arrived 1 year later with the rest of the family. They did not live long once they settled here. However, they did accomplish what they set out to do. They established a new life in the land of milk and honey for all their 9 children. My father was a well-respected craftsman in Prussia, making tables and cabinets. Once he moved to America, he became a farm laborer on rented land. Mom, besides being a housekeeper, also ran a grocery store in Prussia. The move to America was especially rough on her. She was not used to the hardships that life in Woollam presented. I married my husband only 2 years after coming to America. I was yet 17. I was widowed early. He died just 37 years after our marriage, leaving me a widow for the remaining 33 years of my life. As death often does, it came suddenly for Henry. He contracted pneumonia and was dead within a few short days. However, my determined nature, belief in strong discipline, and strong faith in the Lord saw me through the hard times. Our farm was located only a short distance from here, just up the road from the new Woollam store. My husband and brother-in-law, Andrew Lepp, owned that store for a time, as well as a general store in the town of Redbird. When we were first married, we made our home with Henry's widowed mother for a little over a year before buying our own farm, and it was the farm I lived in the rest of my life. Ours began as an arranged marriage, set up by our mothers. Before our wedding day, I had never even had a conversation with Henry. However, I quickly came to love, admire, and respect the man I had married. He was respected as a businessman and also a farmer, as well as a cattle and horse trader. He led cattle drives across the Missouri River at Herman in the dead of winter when the river was frozen over to take them to market. He also took a great interest in the affairs of the community, serving as a Republican committee man and as a tax collector for Third Creek Township. In his later years, he was an auctioneer. Yes, I married me a hard-working, God-fearing man who had a very kindly disposition, something I recommend to the girls of today. By 1880, we had purchased a 130-acre farm. A picturesque creek ran through it. We had horse, cows, sheep, mules, and chickens. That year, we produced 45 pounds of churned butter. We raised corn, oats, wheat, sorghum, Irish potatoes, and had a large apple orchard. I made myself useful by trying to attend to the sick in our community. I found I had this calling while nursing my son Charles, who in his youth suffered a severe burn. I served as the family's spiritual leader. After breakfast every morning, I would hold a prayer service that all present attended. We would all kneel at the bench in the kitchen and pray out loud in German. I spoke broken English, but my best thoughts and prayers were always done in my native German tongue. I lived 88 years and was buried in this cemetery in 1941.